This is the Everything 80s podcast, episode number 3, The Bizarre Story of the Garbage Pail Kids.
If your teacher says you're bad and sends you to the principal, you can be a garbage pail kid. If your parents say you dress like you should be in a carnival, you can be a garbage pail kid. It's international, radical, how anything unusual.
Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome back to the Everything 80s podcast, brought to you by everything80spodcast.com. I'm Jamie, and we are doing the very actually interesting story and history of the Garbage Pail Kids. And that You Could Be a Garbage Pail Kids song playing right now is from the infamous, horrific movie that came out. And we'll get to all that in a second. But just from like researching this whole thing, I was amazed how from like one single random idea, this whole industry and franchise was born. So before we get started, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Google Play, wherever you find them, I should be there. Okay, let's get right to it. So this whole story of the Garbage Pail Kids basically comes down to the idea of you can't blame a company for trying, and in this case, succeeding in creating something culturally significant at the time. Like the 80s was such an explosion of pop culture and so many things, so it was so hard to stand out and be unique. And that's the case with the Garbage Pail Kids. And they were able to do this after the whole Cabbage Patch Kids craze, which I'll get to in a sec. But basically, if this is new to you, the Garbage Pail Kids were a collection of trading cards from 1985 released by Topps. And they were obviously a parody of the massively successful Cabbage Patch Kids. This would lead to lawsuits, bans, a movie, lots of different future releases. So, like, I don't know if you're familiar with Mad Balls, but Garbage Pail Kids were one of those things in the 80s where creators are just kind of like, screw it, kids are going to love these things. And they did. So I think whenever you can kind of rip on something or mock something popular, it always is going to find an audience. So I remember having Garbage Pail Kids trading cards and having to keep them hidden in my desk at school. I don't know if we were one of the schools that had these banned, which I'll talk about in a bit, but they were definitely frowned upon if I remember correctly. So it's kind of that like forbidden fruit aspect for any like toy product or whatever. You can have a hit on your hands. And I think that's what happened with the Garbage Pail Kids. They carved out their own nice little niche corner of the 80s. So we'll look here, like there's no doubt you're aware of Cabbage Patch Kids. And here's a quick rundown on it. So the Cabbage Patch Kids themselves might have been an actual stolen idea that were first created by a woman named Martha Nelson Thomas. She called them doll babies originally. They were softer. They had more of a babyish look compared to like typical dolls that are usually terrifying and look like out of a horror movie. So she would sell them at craft fairs and shows, and they caught the eye of a guy named Xavier Roberts. And you might remember that name because you would see it branded right on the ass of a Cabbage Patch Kid as his signature marker. Also a way to sort of protect the intellectual property and avoid knockoffs and all that sort of thing. So he took them and started to sell them for high prices, and she didn't like it. So he said that if he couldn't sell her dolls, he would sell ones just like them, and he did. So he started to mass produce them. And the difference here is he came up with the whole backstory. And the idea with toys and franchises is how critical backstory is to making them connect with the audience, specifically kids. If you have a doll, okay, whatever. But when you have a doll that comes from an actual Cabbage Patch Kid and has an actual Cabbage Patch and has this story of how they were created, like it just gives it more kind of meaning and context to it, and a kid is able to relate better. So his version with this is now his dolls came with, if you remember, adoption papers. And they also had like unique looks and names, and they had different variations of bodies and heads. So that allowed Coleco, who made them, to have a whole bunch of different versions, leading to more unique dolls. And I think that was one of the appeals there too, is that you weren't buying the same thing that every other kid had. Yours was specifically unique. So this caught on big time. If you're not familiar, there's the Cabbage Patch Kids craze of 1983, which was seen as the real first big toy craze where people were beating the hell out of each other. knocking down doors. There was like, you'd see news reports, kind of like a Black Friday thing. This was like one of the earlier forms of it. So like I said, whenever something is successful, someone always comes around to exploit it. In this case, it was Topps trading cards. And here's a quick little history on Topps trading cards, which I learned more about. They came out of the 30s. So in the 1930s, a lot of supplies were cut off after the First World War, or they were just scarce and harder to get. And there's a company called the American Leaf Tobacco Company, and they decided to go in a different direction because it was harder to get materials and tobacco and whatever. And they decided to get into this new business of this stuff called chewing gum, which was basically not brand new, but essentially brand new, being released to the market. And then they changed their name to Topps. And this was seriously their way of indicating that they would be the tops in this new field. It's that simple and kind of ridiculous. So the first introduction, and that would kind of start off the gum craze, would be Bazooka bubble gum, which I'm sure you're aware of. It was that rock hard piece of gum that came with the small little comic. They released this in 1947. They were a big hit. In the 50s, they started packing their gum with trading cards that featured, before sports cards, they featured Western stars from movies and spaghetti Westerns and that sort of thing. And not long after that, they started making baseball cards. And then sports cards would now be the main focus for Topps. They would put out other cards. They would do other novelty candies that weren't related to baseball, including things called wacky packages. You probably know Mars Attacks. That's where that comes from. And then things called garbage candies. So this allowed them to create like the packaging and the art. It allowed them to work with some really underground artists from the 60s and 70s and really give this unique packaging and look to a product to help it stand out. So this is where the story starts coming together. A lot of the art would focus on a bit of the bizarre and weird style, but created you have to see these things. If you go to the show notes for this episode, so if you go to everything80spodcast.com/3, this is where the whole article is, all the different little images. But you can see this like gross style of this monster continuity they started to create with them. It was kind of in the same vein of Mad Magazine, and these new cards and things were being embraced by that like Mad Magazine community. So the wacky packages card, they were the ones that would try to spoof and mock like regular consumer items like cereals and dish soaps. Like these would be the most popular. They would have a card, this one I'm looking at here, it was called Captain Crud instead of Captain Crunch. And then they would have one called like Gulp Oil and just stuff like that. You can look all these up online and see all the old versions. So it's now 1983 and the Cabbage Patch Kids are on fire. They're the hottest toy possibly ever. They made $2 billion in 1 year, which if converted for today is like closer to 5 million, like 4.8 or something, which is ridiculous for a brand new product. And so since they were a big hit, there was just, no way to let it go by untouched by Topps. They wanted to use this to their advantage somehow. But they wanted to take the regular route and try to put out a series of Cabbage Patch Kids trading cards in 1984. So Coleco, they were kind of a sub company of a bigger company called Appalachian Artworks, who brought out the Cabbage Patch Kids. So some of these creators thought that putting out a line of trading cards was sort of beneath them. And Topps said basically, screw it. And they decided to put out a parody line, as they had success doing this before with wacky packages. So they had already actually come up with a single wacky packages card, and it was called the Garbage Pail Kid. It was just a one-off little thing, one card in a collection of a bunch of different cards. So, but the Topps management thought this might make a good spin-off series. And the series was actually the idea of a Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist named Art Spiegelman. And he would work together with some guys named Mark Newgarden and a guy named Len Brown to see the whole thing through. So Newgarden had come up with that original Garbage Pail Kid drawing for the wacky packages. And then he worked with an artist named John Pound. And he gave him the job of coming up with 44 different drawings to be released for that first card series. And they only gave him 2 months to do it. So what they did to put out more cards was the idea they would give 2 different names to each card. I don't know if you remember this or collected the original series. Each character would have 2 different names on it. So that would end up with 88 cards to make up that first series. And then it was thought, this will be a one-off series because it's such a singular idea. It didn't seem like something that you could really spread and grow over time. So the first packs would cost 25 cents. And in that, you got 5 cards and a stick of gum that you remember that was so hard it would shatter when you tried to chew it. And it was covered in this felt like talcum powder. Yeah, actually all sports card gum felt like that. They stopped taking, depends how old you are listening to this, and if you remember gum being in trading card packages, they started taking the gum out because the gum would stick sometimes to the card or whatever card it was on at the front. And when you would take the gum off, it would sometimes rip the card. And that was one of the reasons they took them out. So series 1 of the Garbage Pail Kids comes out, and I remember this very well. It's a huge hit. You could barely find these things in convenience stores, 7-Elevens, gas stations, novelty stores. As soon as they were coming in, they were selling out. They're gone. And if you remember some of the characters from this first series, you had people like Nasty Nick, Junk Food John, Up Chuck, Dead Ted, Fry and Brian, Atom Bomb, Booze and Bruce, Virus Iris, Rundown Rhoda. There's a lot more. As looking back on these, they're really funny, and then some are so actually inappropriate that I won't mention that there's no way these things would be released today. Like, they really actually pushed it, but it was 1984. No one really gave a crap. So then they would release series 2, and that's a little more of when the controversy would come in. So they now needed a ton of art to be able to keep up with the huge demand for the second series. So there's no way one guy would be able to keep up with all this work. So they needed more artists that would be able to capture the style and the tone. And so there'd be some consistency across the line. So now, as the Garbage Pail Kids are becoming more popular, so does the opposition to them. Like I said, my school sort of frowned upon them, and schools were straight up banning them, not just because they were like inappropriate or lewd or whatever, but they were becoming a huge distraction in classes. And I remember definitely having to keep them under wraps and kind of keep them. I remember having these little pencil crayon boxes, and we'd keep them in there and then have to show them at recess to each other. But I went to a public school that banned the use of, I don't know if you ever played marbles, where the way we did it, not just where you would roll a marble and get the one closest to it. We would dig out these little sort of pot holes. That sounds terrible. The little holes with our heels. And you would have to try and sink the marble into that, and you would go one-on-one, and the first person to get in the fewest amount of moves would win. Our school banned that because it was seen as a form of gambling. So that tells you where I'm coming from. So Garbage Pail Kids are so big, they would release 6 different series just in that one year. And all the public controversy is just making them more and more popular. And this is one of those perfect situations of there's no such thing as bad press. And for Topps, this was 100% the case. So anytime a negative report or article came out dismissing the Garbage Pail Kids, the demand and the sales went up. And if you go again to those show notes, everything80spodcast.com/3, there's a news report I have from CBS in 1986, which is talking about, is this Dan Rather? I can't remember who it was. It's talking about how negative these things are, how they're contributing to juvenile delinquency, the whole deal. Same thing that happened with The Simpsons when it came out. But it's kind of funny because CBS would try and put out a cartoon version a bit later, which we'll get to. So I feel like this works so well that Topps was actually behind all this negative press, because there's nothing that makes a kid want something more than being told they can't have it. And Garbage Pail Kids felt like it had this sort of underground vibe to it. It was like you were trading contraband, but we all loved it. So, and then here come the lawsuits, and I'm surprised this didn't happen earlier on, because they're now 6 series into this thing, and the original company that owned Cabbage Patch Kids, I mentioned Appalachian Artworks, obviously sues Topps for copyright infringement. They said that Garbage Pail Kids were doing real damage to the Cabbage Patch Kids brand, and I do kind of see this because I remember it seeming like they really took down the Cabbage Patch Kids a notch. They really kind of belittled and mocked them, and they didn't have the same allure or luster to them. But I mean, I don't know how you can feel sorry for $1 billion toy, but whatever. So Topps was ordered to immediately stop production until a judgment was decided. But in the mind of Topps, they believed they were only doing a parody, so Cabbage Patch Kids would be fair game. The judge had a different idea, though, and he saw it more as piracy. He said the Garbage Pail Kids were making money because of another intellectual property. Basically, Garbage Pail Kids could not really exist if it wasn't for Cabbage Patch Kids. So I'm not a lawyer, spoiler alert here, but I do see both sides of this argument now that I look at it. But Topps, they basically had to end up altering the appearance of the characters in their trading cards to really distance themselves from any kind of Cabbage Patch Kids likeness. So they would have to do things like change the logo. They would have to change the actual aesthetic appearance of the kids. They had to make it so like there wasn't really any similarity, but the problem is they're already so established that I don't see how. I'm amazed they're actually able to keep producing them. So that brings us to the Garbage Pail Kids movie. And this was kind of like the last kick at the can for Topps. The Garbage Pail Kids movie was released in August of 1987. And I don't know if you've seen this thing, but the basic plot is about a kid who's being bullied. And while he's being harassed one day, he knocks over a garbage can, spills out some green ooze. The bullies bring this kid down into a sewer, and when the green ooze has now leaked into the sewer, somehow he gets saved by the Garbage Pail Kids. They all get into a lot of mishaps, and then that's the actual plot. The Garbage Pail Kids are attempted to be taken to a prison for ugly people to be executed. It doesn't happen, and they basically get away, and they carry on making mishaps. So like, this is a real thing, and honestly, this is a complete Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles ripoff. If you haven't seen this, or you did, you know the movie did horribly, and it's considered one of the worst movies of all time for a bunch of reasons. First off, it was only shot in 2 months and made for just around $1 million. It only made around $1.5 million overall. It was considered a massive failure when you factor in, the money spent advertising and things like that. So, I mean, the critics hated it. The fans hated it. It's got a 0% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Just a train wreck. They're just trying to crank this thing out while they still had a little bit of popularity, which I understand. Here's a few more fun facts. I don't know if you know Jim Cummings, who's the voice of Winnie the Pooh. He did 2 voices in the movie and later said he regretted making it. The original plan was to make it more of a real horror movie, but they realized what a stupid idea that would be because their target audience wouldn't be allowed to see it. If it was like a straight up horror movie, I think it would have been more successful. I think this idea really would have worked well for that. And then another thing, the kid who played the main character of Dodger, I don't know if you've ever met a kid named Dodger, but that was his name. He auditioned and signed on for it without telling his parents. And it blows my mind, like, kids were able to do something like that. I mean, he's not super young. I don't know if he's even maybe 12 or 13, but whatever. And his father was actor John Astin, who played Gomez in the old Addams Family. And so his kid got this role. His dad, John Astin, reads through the script, thinks it's so bad, he tries to get his son out of it, but he couldn't because he was already... How is a kid legally allowed to sign on for a movie and be contractually obligated to do it? Whatever. So, again, I'm sort of surprised it did that bad. I thought there was still enough interest that enough people would have gone to see it before the word got around how crappy it was. I mean, this is, pre-internet. It was harder for bad word to spread. I mean, it would, but it would take a while before it did, and you'd think more people would see it. So, they're rushing out a hot commodity, but it's already 1987 and the interest is pretty much faded at this point. Over the years, they would try to revamp it. Actually, Michael Eisner from Disney tried to do a remake of it in 2012, but didn't get any support behind it. So, I mean, kudos to him for at least trying. So this is weird too. This gets into the Garbage Pail Kids cartoon show, which you have not seen. Well, actually, you can now if it was on DVD. But in 1987, so the same year as the movie, a Garbage Pail Kids animated show was put together by a guy named Flint Deal. I don't know if I'm saying that right, or Delay. He was actually very instrumental in bringing us things like G.I. Joe, Transformers, helped create the Five Goes West movie, and an entire season was ordered by CBS, as it was thought there was still enough interest in this thing, despite how bad the movie had been. So I remember, I don't know if you remember this, I remember it specifically being heavily promoted going into the 1987-88 season. I remember the commercials very well, the little trailers after other big cartoons, like just trying to push this thing. And then people go nuts about it, specifically a few groups: the Action for Children's Television, the National Coalition on Television Violence, and the Christian Leaders for Responsible Television. They go berserk over this thing. And due to all the protests, CBS removed it from their schedule 2 days before the thing was supposed to debut. And then they replaced it with reruns of the Muppet Babies. So it's not all bad. The problem was the series was seen as being too violent. It ridiculed disabled people. And I understand, obviously, the complaints. But I think the big issue that actually got it pulled was the negative attention that made companies like McDonald's, Nabisco, Crayola, they pulled out of the advertising, and CBS wanted to obviously keep them happy for other advertising and future advertising. There's no shock how powerful McDonald's is, but it's amazing how much they dictate things like movies and TV shows. And I'll have an episode all about the history of the Happy Meal, which you'd be amazed how McDonald's dictated how movies like Batman Returns, all those modern Batmans, like Batman, you remember like the original Batman and then Batman Returns, the Tim Burton ones, had a very like dark feel. And then they went into this more like cartoony, campy thing. That was basically because of McDonald's saying they had to change this or they wouldn't be able to do any promotional tie-ins. That's how important and powerful advertising is. They actually were able to make Steven Spielberg change a bunch of scenes from the original Jurassic Park. That the movie's already violent, but it was going to be even more violent, and they made him take scenes out, and he actually did. Like they were able, commerce is able to dictate what is going to happen with art. It's unbelievable. So the thing, the problem is with this, the advertisers never even pre-screened the show. They were just going on what they heard. So they made 13 episodes. These are all done, ready to go. No one ever saw them. They were never broadcast. The only time you were able to see them is when they were released on DVD in 2006. Okay, so let's start wrapping this up here. Personally, I think the Garbage Pail Kids were awesome. I think it captured this rebellious sort of tone, pissed off a lot of people, perfect for a kid, right? I think they made a huge mark on the culture and society of the 80s, and they've really definitely cemented their place in history. And I think now, as it always happens, we look back on them more fondly. And there have been many re-released sets of the cards. They did an all-new series in 2003, 2005, 2006. They did a 25th anniversary set in 2010 and a brand new series set in 2012, and then a 30th anniversary series in 2015. So I think we'll be hearing from the Garbage Pail Kids still in the future in some form or another. Just don't tell the National Coalition on Television Violence. They don't have much of a sense of humor. Okay, so that'll be it on the Garbage Pail Kids. Thanks for joining me. I think this is an interesting story. Hopefully you learned a lot from this. And like I said, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe wherever you find your podcast. And if you really like the show, give it a rating and review. That helps it out. More people get to see it. Okay, thank you, and I'll see you later.
If your teacher says you're bad.